So hopefully you're joining me on the back of part 1, where I discuss software development as a whole, languages, compilers and all that kind of interesting information, because I'm going to assume that all of that is known in your head when I discuss what comes next. So please don't ask me for questions, please just jump straight to the link in the video above or at the bottom of the description to go to that video, which will help a lot of this make sense. But many of you may already know all this anyway, so you can jump straight in to this next gen discussion. So we've covered what happened in the previous generation, how things work, some of the challenges and some of the challenges that happen in software development as a whole. So this video we're going to discuss just what comes ahead in next gen development. Now some of this is based on conversation with developers that I've seen, but nothing here breaks any NDAs. So a lot of this is based on factual information, based on what I've seen, what I've heard, what I've been shown, and also what I know anyway. So I'm not going to break anything that's not known. So you are going to look forward to a lot of surprises, a lot of changes, a lot of things that will be different in the next generation. But what I can discuss is things that maybe are not as widely known, but the information's out there in the public anyway. If you try and dig in and get that information, you'd put all the pieces together. So nothing here breaks any rules, nothing here is spoiling anyone's party. I want to make that clear because that's just not what I do. Okay, so let's talk about the next generation development cycle. And that really comes down to two main splits, which was discussed in the previous video. Sony and Microsoft do not have an identical path that they're following. There's a very different strategy, very different process and very different procedures around how they're doing things. So one of those is the fact that Microsoft's strategy enables them to have multiple platforms running the same software with improvements within that environment. You've seen that already with the Xbox One, the Xbox One S, very minor as it may be, but it's there, and obviously the Xbox One X. This will continue with the Series X and any other consoles that may come from that party. Now, in addition to this, there's obviously a lot of improvements they can add, and this all comes around the APIs and the operating systems and the hardware level improvements that are exposed by those APIs, and they don't always need software development from the game developers to push that forward. So let's discuss the backwards compatibility, which I covered in depth in my previous video and obviously other videos. So for the next generation, let's talk about the Series X and what it means.
At Xbox, we want to deliver a world where you have more freedom and choice to play the games you want, with the people you want, on the devices you want. A world where you can play without boundaries. A world beyond generations.
It's a bold statement there from Phil, and it's a very truthful one in terms of what their strategy is, as I've already covered. See, BC from Microsoft will just carry over and will even improve performance within those games' targets over what we see now. So BC games that almost hit a locked 60 on the Xbox One X, such as the Ghost Recon, could now be a fully locked 60 on Series X or other family of consoles. They will update the emulator once more for the new consoles to offer further enhancements, such as far more HDR support retrofitted into them and other boosts. Now, this technique is very clever indeed, and effectively it's what I've discussed many years ago about games using a HDR pipeline. The thing is that all these games are tone mapped down to work on the current screen at an 8-bit resolution. This is the Rec 709 color system, and this effectively means that games are actually doing all the work to create those additional shades and color ranges from brightness to darkness, and then clipping that back down to 8-bit to fit inside the standard television. That process will be stopped just as it's tone mapped down for the display back on the output buffer to flip it back to 10-bit and then give you that full HDR range that the game was originally designed with in terms of its lighting. And that basically goes from 8-bit to 10-bit per pixel, and that's 2 bits per channel. That effectively gives you a huge increase of those color scheme systems, and that's exactly what we're seeing in modern titles, which means many old titles will look drastically different and improved that move from this difference in shade color. We've seen this in some of the titles that are already supporting HDR now on the Xbox One X and the Xbox One S, but this was very much a toe in the water from Microsoft, and they're going to expand this in the next generation. Using the same process at an operating system level, they're going to take control of the image output and adapt it to HDR, basically reconstruct that missing color palette if it's not there and add it back in. I'm very interested to see just how this works. This is in collaboration with the ATG group within Xbox or Microsoft. So the solutions here will be very beneficial to a huge amount of titles, but the older titles such as the 360 ones may not work just as well as everyone hoped, but it will be interesting to see. And where the option doesn't work well with the artistic tone or style meant by the developer, you can just turn it off in the operating system. This will be beneficial for the points where it does. And that will just enhance that visual aspect on those HDR 4K screens we all now have, or many of us have, or are aspiring to in this next leap of generations. And this really just adds additional benefits to the backwards compatibility catalogue, and seeing those older games look even better than they originally did on the host hardware.
Damn it. Come on.
I'm gonna say no. Hard passing.
And obviously this push for HDR means it will carry across the entire generation, as the baseline is set that everything will support HDR. That means we'll see it across all the current titles that already push it, and new titles will be far more dominant with HDR solutions and no longer tone mapped down, such as Gran Turismo GT Sport, which is exceptional, Gears 5 and many others that will push that. And this will improve both console and PC space. Now I'm not saying every title will be HDR, because that will be too much of a push, but I just hope that they have an option to turn it off. That's the only thing that I'm stressing in my conversation.
You wouldn't even care if she was.
Mind your tongue, boy! Until our journey is over, one of us must remain focused.
Now there is another element in terms of these backwards compatibility titles that Xbox is pushing, and it's something that's been around for a long time. There's the option to interpolate frame rates. Certainly VR has been in a similar situation for a while in terms of time warping your head movement. But the statement from Microsoft is they're taking a select few titles that will be able to double the frame rate from 30 to 60 or 60 to 120. Now this means that they're either in the operating system interpolating that frame rate back, or they're managing to unlock it and run it at a higher frame rate, or they've managed to incorporate something within their recompile that actually disables this, and where titles that don't get affected by unlocking the frame rate with their logic and speed, this means that they can run at the higher refresh rate. This is all guesswork, though. I do not know the ins and outs of this particular function that they're offering. And how it will affect input latency, frame times, juddering and all that kind of elements is something that, again, I'm very interested in seeing. Now Sony has not made the concerted effort Microsoft has on its BC solutions at all. It seems it is more a bonus than a core feature, and this is not to say they have not done any work on this though, with the PS2 seeing an excellent emulator released midway through the PS4, and on those PS2 titles we see significant improvements. It's really only being used on PS Now though, but it does offer a 2x resolution increase over the original titles, and sometimes 4x, along with a better performance metric. It doesn't improve the frame rates over the original target, but it does smooth out a lot of the dips. Now you cannot play your own discs on the system, but you can stream or download from the PlayStation servers. The option here on the PS5 is to look back into its PS3 catalogue, and maybe even further than the current PS2 emulation on PS4, and add in an on-site PS3 emulator, which it already has within its remote servers and would be fully possible now with the PS5. Do not hold your breath on this though, as PS Now has you covered on PS3 titles remotely, but the local download option may improve to add PS3 into the current PS2 and PS4 support. It would certainly do them no harm, and it could offer a great new revenue stream via store purchases or extension of PS Now's appeal, which is going to be a major focus for PS5. It also is a benefit for them for selling their older titles on the Xbox store, so you have to keep all these factors from a business perspective in mind, and sometimes, just sometimes, that benefits the consumer directly with the options such as these BC elements. But don't expect a huge push on this, as Sony are very keen to keep that generation process going, so having the option to play backwards compatibility titles is always going to be an addition rather than a core feature. But having those options early on in the generation always helps that transition from the current generation to the newer one, if there are options to play your older titles. That natural segue brings us nicely onto the BC dream as it continues for the current generation, being able to run native code on the new machines. Now, as Microsoft have exposed more of the new hardware within their API and OS, almost certainly, then unpatched titles could also see an improvement over their current best on X. The Series X will likely use all 52 CUs, 12 more than the X, now running at 1.8 GHz rather than 1172 MHz, over a 50% increase in frequency and even more in total performance of the GPU, and potentially the 1.5 GHz increase across all 8 cores with SMT turned off, which is most likely the option that these backwards titles will run, which is over twice the frequency of the Xbox One alone. And this will also be true of X titles themselves. For example, the disc version of Resident Evil 3 I covered on all formats ran at 4K 60 on the X, which was more than the hardware was capable of, and later dropped via a Capcom patch to run at a better suited 1620p, and this drastically improved that target of 60 FPS. Now the Series X could run this pre-patched version at 4K 60 locked, potentially if that new environment enables such abstraction, and certainly clean up any of those dips at 1620p, and I fully expect this to be the case. Base expectations are you get twice the CPU performance, 70% more bandwidth, and 50% on the GPU as a minimum for native titles in the new boosted profile, with that hardware boost coming over the X. Now, for all intents and purposes, the Xbox One is now a PC with a cut down Windows kernel, UWP support, and cross APIs, offering the same level of game scaling within that environment. This is specifically what Microsoft have and are targeting for this launch.
Gotta get that train moving.
And these expectations will carry over to the PS4 and the Pro games, and actually they'll see a bigger boost. Dynamically scaled titles such as Doom or Spider-Man will now max out resolution and frame rate with no issues at all. Bloodborne could finally see a perfectly paced 33 millisecond game at 30 FPS from this vast increase in performance, without any game code touched. Now, to be clear, this is the same discussion we've just had on the X and the Xbox One. These are the exact same shipped disc versions or downloaded ones for the PS4 and the Pro, and just like the Series X, these are the same compiled versions to run on the current generation, not the new one. But they run natively under this new operating system, and where possible, using the boosted clocks on the Pro, and where not, then the hardware incorporated backwards compatibility into both the GPU and the CPU, the APU as a total, which has been supported by AMD specifically. They need to get the credit here, and Sony themselves. They kick in and then run those games at the ideal PS4 mode if it's 800 MHz for the GPU, or the PS4 Pro mode if it's 911 MHz for the GPU. The new Zen CPU will natively run the instruction set and largely mimic the timings of the old Jaguar CPUs if required, which means worst case scenario you get identical performance levels in this mode of the PS4 or the Pro, but likely you'll get slight boosts anyway just to the native improvement from the hardware, the environment, the bandwidth. Just those subtle changes will give you small increases but not much. But I suspect a large potential of the titles will fully support these boosted modes natively in the operating system. Now, in all likelihood, just like the Pro, this will be an option within the operating system to turn it on or off where games have an issue and you default back to the standard native hardware cycle emulation that I've just talked about, the timing logic to grant those two modes of support. But games that do not need to do that will gain all that benefit, but they'll only run at the maximum level intended in their game package, both on the disc or the download or the current patch version that's available now. These are native compiled versions designed to run on the current generation of hardware, be it the PS4, the Pro, the X or the Xbox One. This means that the limitation will still be what was designed in the original code and no more, and that will leave a lot of performance headroom on the table. This does mean though that the flip over to the new generation is much better and more satisfying because you can now sell your console and keep your library, and also experience quite a decent level of improvement across various titles by playing the exact same game on that piece of hardware. So beyond those native modes, what other options do you get to boost current titles? And I've seen some confusion on this regarding patches and downloads and executables. So just like the Pro and the X, there will be the option for game developers to actually release a specific game patch that will unlock some of the functions and hardware the new API exposes. Some. but it will still be compiled to support the current generation platforms on their specific compilers. But they could and will still run on the current generation of hardware and the new one, but using that boosted mode and getting more from it. Now, Xbox's option here is they're really running a higher level of abstraction, and they want to merge generations, which is, like most things, a double-edged sword. The results here will be interesting, but we could see significant leaps in the boosted modes on both of these platforms when a specific game patch is released, and it will take advantage of that core throughput improvement the new hardware has. Essentially, this would be nothing more than just tweaking the current engine options, the configuration settings that are available within the game engine already, and thereby using the potential on the table a little better. This will mean things like increasing resolutions to 4K, adding additional effects such as higher resolution shadows, better particle effects, turning on screen space reflections, or just unlocking the frame rate up to 60, or if possible, even higher at 120 FPS. And all this can be done very, very easy and simply within the code, and it only needs a very small engineer to go in, do the programming work, test it, release a QA and get it out to the system.
Except 1/8 your size.
I shall call him Mini-Me.
I expect these to land around the hardware's launch. This will be an example of things like Red Dead Redemption 2. They could go in and improve the settings to PC's maximum, and then also unlock the frame rate, run it at 4K, and then both the Series X and the PS5 could run this game at 4K 60 with better effects. Very simple, and it just improves performance, and it also increases sales. And I do expect some of these patches to come and to be subsidised for third party and first party. So take something like Gears 5 for example. This could really be a patch that actually just increases the effects to the maximum on PC, plus a little more if it was already in the engine, unlock the frame rate to 120 FPS, put an option in the menu to choose your resolution and your frame rate style, and then really push the Series X a little harder. Not maximise it, just push it a little harder. It'll make more use of that CPU and GPU. Likewise, Guerrilla Games could release a patch for Horizon, which is headed to PC very soon, and unlock that to run at 4K 60 FPS using the additional options within the engine work they've done for the PC release, and then that will just improve performance, improve sales and word of mouth on the PS5 platform. And this is again something you need to look at in terms of what Sony are doing and those upcoming PC releases of PS4 titles. It highlights a potential sign here on what they're looking to do. So you might see some of these games hitting it, such as Death Stranding, also receiving a patch to push it to 60 FPS within the native code, just using that hardware a little better. But the most exciting part of all of these new pieces of hardware, and what we really care about, is that generational leap. Everyone is moving towards new generation for a reason, and that isn't really to play your old games at a slightly better frame rate. The most exciting part is to use that hardware and let it shine with brand new compiled versions with these machines in mind. Now, I know many sites are talking about patches and Series X or PS5 update patches being released, and I've just mentioned it just now. But there will only be, as I've just described. Any true next generation game will be a brand new full download of the game or a completely brand spanking new disc, and it will not be the same executable as now, and a patch won't work with it. Now, this is why Microsoft are supporting and marketing the smart delivery on Series X. This is not a patch, but instead a brand new build of the game by the developers. It's entirely new game code that will come from the digital download when you buy it online, or validated via a DRM option on the disc, just like the current BC version of Xbox and 360 games. This will be a brand new compiled version using that specific new compiler and SDK created for the hardware, and it will take full advantage of the benefit it offers. These will be things such as mesh shaders, primitive shaders, ray tracing, SSD streaming, DMA access, decompression and addressing, spatial audio processing, all those additional and very exciting operating system functions, the new controllers and much, much more. None of this is possible from the boost mode or those small game patches over and above minor tweaks or anything handled within the kernel and the operating system itself. Any quick and early patches from the teams will offer increases to resolution or effects work, or just unlock frame rates. Now, as I say, I do expect that these patches will come to boost games early on, but really All teams are only restricted to releasing a title across any of the platforms, not all of them. Teams are free to make games that run on the PS5 and the Pro and the PS4, or only one of them, or any combination thereof. The same rules, or lack thereof, apply to Xbox as well. Teams can opt in or out of smart delivery. No one's enforcing you to do this, and many teams won't do it. In fact, we already know of teams that are choosing not to do that and just release a specific Series X game. The only rule, which is perfectly normal for most games and generations and platforms, is they support the new consoles via the latest API and SDK. But supporting merely means you can test it works or fix any issues raised when tested by the platform holder when submitted to QA approval. This could be via a native PS4 support to a fully fledged brand spanking new Series X XE or anywhere in between. Now, like the X and the Pro, we will see titles that do not run any better effects or features than the base machines early on, and this is perfectly fine. Supporting a new platform is not the same thing as taking advantage of it, remember, and this is where people get confused. And this can and will go both ways. You'll have teams only shipping PS5 or Series X versions, leaving both last generations, premium and all, far behind them. And in fact, this is exactly what you're going to see. In the next few days, you'll see Sony's release of all these titles that are made specifically with the PS5 in mind. With Microsoft, they're taking a different tactic. Many of their teams and studios do not have anything ready to ship close to launch that's really going to maximize that potential. Look at the smart delivery titles: Hellblade, Halo Infinite, Cyberpunk 2077. They're all going to be smart delivery because they're all going to ship on current generation and the new generation. And this is largely up to the individual developers. We've already seen EA are not really going to support this. We've seen Destiny 2 is going to support it on the PS5. So this is all really down to the manufacturers and the publishers of the title, not really the platform holders. And that's always been the case. You can ask people to do things, but you can't force them. This is going to impact the PS5 and the Xbox just as much because it's not really their choice. And really, it's all about marketing to make you buy the hardware now and hope for the games later on. We're probably in for a slightly longer wait to see just what Microsoft have in store when they really want to ship direct brand spanking new Series X titles. I'm sure in the reveal in July we're going to see some first party bangers that are really going to show the potential of the Series X, but I'm not going to commit to the fact that they're going to launch at the hardware's launch, whereas I think Sony will definitely be launching big PS5 titles on launch day that will take advantage of the hardware and the SSDs that we're about to see. I fully expect Horizon 2 to be in that list. Bluepoint Games with whatever they've been cooking up, brand spanking new IPs, and just look at the big studios of Sony first party you haven't seen over the last couple of years, so we could be in for an angry god just making a surprise appearance. So is this a bad thing then? Of course not. It's great, as it means we have a great deal to look forward to, and I will be very busy with testing the new formats and cascade of titles, new and old, across them all. It is going to be a very exciting generation, as much has changed this time over the last, and the choices that have been made and the road ahead are much foggier than they were last time. But I'm looking forward to that journey and helping to clear the path. Anyway, that's it for now. I hope you enjoyed this and slightly longer video, but I wanted to cover a great deal. There's much more to come, much more to discuss, but for now, Next Generation awaits, and those games won't play themselves. Well, maybe some of them do. I'll catch you on the next one.
Boy, look at me.
We did it.
You are not ready.